It's my pleasure to introduce Katherine Teh-White, the chair for this next panel this afternoon on Nexus corporate stewardship, how business is involved in improving resource use. Katherine is the managing director of Futureye, an organisation that she's founded. She's spent much of her career working on supporting, facilitating and enabling dialogue and conversation, in particular in bridging the gaps between communities, businesses and government. Katherine, they're at your tender mercy.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Now, I was told at lunchtime that as a result of people having a great meal that they were going to sort of fall asleep. I don't think you're going to be able to do that because we've got a really riveting panel coming up. We're going to be exploring the role of companies and particularly thinking about how companies might engage with the issue of Nexus. I think in the sessions that we had earlier today, there seemed to me to be potentially a bit of a gap between understanding what's going on in a corporate context on corporate responsibility and the approaches that have been taken, and the bridge the gap exists between that and the way civil society or academia perceives the role of companies. So in this session we're really going to look at where are the failures occurring, what are the dilemmas, what are the case studies, how are these multi-sectoral partnerships being formed, and then particularly look at what are the critical issues that need to be tackled in order to resolve the nexus and the interrelationship issues. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chair the session, and I'd like to introduce Stuart, who will take us away with the first presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here today and to give a talk. My name is Stuart. I'm the head of water stewardship at WWF International. We started our water stewardship program about 5 years ago. We were anticipating a trend that we were witnessing, and that was the increased interest from the private sector in water issues. At that time, the discussions were on concepts such as water footprint. As water footprint came onto the market, it became very easy for us to start to measure the amount of water that companies used and depended on. And that was really the very beginning of some really interesting conversations with companies like SAB Miller and Coke and Pepsi, where we were sitting around asking the question, what does water neutrality look like? Or what does water offsetting look like? And that was really an interesting beginning for us. Where we are today from that point 5 or 6 years ago is incredibly different. It's been a rapid rise. The number of companies, financial institutions, aspects of the private sector that now are part of this discussion has increased incredibly. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot of it from our perspective. We are one of the world's largest conservation organizations. We're 7,000 people in 90 countries. I've got 460 who work on fresh water and 40 who work just specifically with the private sector. And we learned a very, very long time ago that if we were going to protect the places and the things we cared about, that we had to engage power. And we do that, from the highest levels of government to national planning to business. You can't sit on the outside and pretend they don't exist. They sit in our river basins, they source, they produce, they pollute. We have to go engage them. That's the beginning of our whole discussion on stewardship. I have to be honest, when I first heard the term nexus, I was pretty skeptical. I kind of thought, oh God, more jargon. This is going to be fun. And I think I had that reaction because I came from the water community. And I think like a lot of people in the water community, we've been talking about trading off for a very, very long time. The discussion of dams and agriculture and infrastructure is something that's been very, very near and dear to water resource management over the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's something we've dealt with. And if you look at it from our perspective, then we track freshwater species. We've been losing freshwater species, not just abundance, but actual species, faster than terrestrial or marine. So we've been trading off what we care about for a very, very long time. And in fact, when we were founded 50 years ago, our very first project was a freshwater project. So this is an issue that we've been dealing with, and to hear people talking about the nexus was a little bit, oh God, I feel like we were going backwards again. But actually, when you thought about it a little while and you dug around, what was really interesting to me is it was really being driven by the private sector. Yes, you've always had that academic discussion of the Nexus in some way, shape, or form. But at that time, I was on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on water security. And there was a number of us that sat around for a couple of years, and we really thought through this idea of the Nexus. And as a result was this book that came out, I think in 2010, just before the Bonn conference. And it was really perspectives from the private sector and our experience on what is the Nexus and what does it mean to us. Looking back at it now, perhaps it's a little bit naive, but the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of this Nexus discussion that we're having right here today is actually because the private sector is driving a really interesting debate. And I want to get underneath to explain to you why they're driving that debate. You've seen this slide a few times in the last couple of days. I may not be the last, we'll see. But I think it's really interesting. The World Economic Forum puts out their global risk report every year. This is 2014, came out about a month ago. And at the very top, you see three very important global risks. These are energy prices, water supply, and food shortages. These aren't just environmental risks. These are systemic issues that the World Economic Forum and the global CEOs think will affect future economic growth. Okay, so you have these issues now at the top level of business interest and understanding. That's an opportunity for us if we think about it in the right terms. The question for me is, what does that mean for business? How do they respond to the fact that they've identified these things as big systemic risks? I've been doing a lot of talking recently with mining companies. I was in South Africa recently for a mining indaba where they invited me to speak about water and water stewardship. It's incredible to watch how the mining sector has shifted their thinking away from water as a burden as to water being a risk and an opportunity. And that's really opened up a world of opportunity with us to engage with them in a very, very different way. ICMM, the International Council for Mining and Metals, is about to come out with a very new water strategy, and it's very good, I think. It's very progressive. They're pushing the sector and the industry away from how they have dealt with water into seeing it as one of their biggest risks. And they will tell you it is. We've got a number of mining companies telling us that they have stranded assets of as much as $1 billion in the ground because they don't have enough water to get it out. So they know the value at risk when they don't have enough water. Of course, there's the social issues with water. There's all the issues in South America, in Peru in particular, around mining right now and water. So it's top of their mind. Of course, we've seen events like this in the Yangtze where we had a drought 4 years ago. It had a huge impact on shipping and hydropower generation, massive impact on fisheries and agriculture. Again, when put in economic terms and in terms that the private sector understands, it's a huge risk, and they don't want this kind of risk. The Texas droughts, which I'm sure you're very, very familiar with, had a real impact in the sense that for the first time, perhaps, farmers in the energy sector were forced to come together and discuss actually who has rights to water. How are we going to allocate water in the future? And this had a huge impact on the number of coal-fired power plants that were going to be built that aren't going to be built any longer because they are under an extreme stress system, not to mention the costs and commodity prices, et cetera. So a number of sectors affected by risk. We've seen in Europe a lot of expose to supply chains. This is asparagus grown in the Peruvian desert. It was a big supply chain to European supermarkets. And it's had a huge effect on how the retailers in Europe have looked about the provenance of their supply chains and asked questions around water, again, that they weren't asking before. And this is what Footprint has allowed them to do. Look into their supply chains, ask some questions. And this has had real effect on buying and provenance. And of course, there's the reputational damage that comes along from other NGOs, in this case Greenpeace, who put together this expose on cotton supply chains, and in this piece of work implicated a number of companies from Levi's and H&M and Puma, IKEA, all the big cotton and apparel companies. And basically this report said your tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers in China are your problem, go figure it out. And that really set the cat amongst the pigeons. And I can tell you from working with those companies that they are moving very rapidly in trying to understand these issues and work as progressively as they can to sort out their supply chains. Another pressure is coming from the market. In this sense, it's from the investors. People mentioned the investor community this morning about the role of them in this. One hand, I'm very excited about the fact that the investors are waking up to water. On the other side, I'm very terrified because I don't think they understand it very well. And I want to make sure that their investment flows go the right way. I do not want to see them disincentivize or disinvest from companies that are in water-scarce areas, for example. That is not a signal of bad. We should be rating companies not on where they are, but how they're performing. And so there's a lot of education that needs to go on here. But the point is that 5 or 6 years ago when we started this whole discussion, there wasn't a single financial institution that had a paper on water and water risk. Every bank has a paper on water and water risk today. I think JP Morgan's Watching Water report was really a watershed in that sense. And of course, up until this year, you see your rise on capital there saying, investors also know a damaging inaction, appropriate action, or delaying interventions on water-related issues can, and they say the global economy will favor businesses that take proactive approach to water stewardship. So what we're also seeing is signals in the market saying that companies that do good, we can reward them. We can start to set up funding around that. So there's some interesting opportunities. I put the last piece in from Moody's because that was more an investor warning, saying that actually the amount of money that mining companies are spending now to secure water is not making them a very good investment any longer. So there's a number of discussions going on with the investor community around their risks to their portfolio, their long-term risks to their clients, what their technical assistance or due diligence looks like, and if we're smart, we can redirect those flows into the discussions we're having here about the Nexus. A theory of change is good once in a while. This is one I'll propose to you. This is a theory of change that we built around water, but I think it's applicable to the Nexus. And I just want to take you through this. I came up with this a few years ago when trying to explain to people what companies do when they think about water. What's the journey they take? But I think they take this journey in a number of issues. And the point here is it's from a very, very beginning of being aware of the issue to understanding your risk and your footprint to then going and doing something about it and setting targets to a point where you realize actually collective action and governance are your real issues. The governance of these global commons are the things that are causing you problems. And that's really the evolution of what we're seeing stewardship. All the tools and all of these different interventions we're witnessing are traveling along this journey. But it's worth just separating this for a second because it has real implications for what it means to business and what it means to us as NGOs and you as practitioners and academics who may be not sure about what the private sector is doing. These first 3 steps are what the private sector has always done. They're very good at driving efficiency. They're very good at setting internal targets. They're very, very good at getting their ducks in a row. They did this on carbon very well. They're doing it in water. I think the point here is that this is where you focus on products, and this is where you focus on impacts. This is where you focus on the things that you do to the environment. Whereas I think the Nexus discussion is moving the discussion above this line. And it's saying it's not about necessarily your impacts, although those are important. It's how you are impacted by the failure of government or others to manage the things that you really care about, the water supply, the energy supply, the infrastructure, the human rights to other people, the fact that downstream communities may not be receiving water. That's the space where water stewardship is moving rapidly. And you heard about the WRG and these other groups. That's where they are. That's where they are. They're up there. They want to convene and talk to people outside the fence line because the same things that you and I care about as environmentalists around ecosystem functions and biodiversity are actually the things that underpin business risk. They need that too. And it's that realization that actually we need the same thing that's driving quite a collaborative approach. If anything, I think the public sector is behind in this discussion. I don't think they understand private sector risk nearly as well as they need to. Again, just to follow on that investor report, I think the CDP report that was mentioned today, Carbon Disclosure Project, interesting report, it's worth reading. They're called the smallest NGO you've never heard of, but very, very influential. They represent market capital investors to disclose carbon and water information from companies. And their latest report highlights some really interesting findings. That 70% of the companies reported exposure to one or more water-related risks, and that 2/3 expect to have both impacts in supply chains and operation in the next 5 years. These are pretty high numbers. But then you get to the last point, and they say that very few companies actually have targets that address those 2 upper steps I've just shown you. Most of them address everything down below. So there's a real mismatch between the fact that companies are identifying risk and the fact that there's not much action or target setting above that dotted line. That is going to shift. I see it shifting already. I think there's a number of leading companies here who are making those kinds of targets. But I think this is really instructive because it's also telling us that we don't really yet have the infrastructure to hold these kinds of private sector, public sector, NGO discussions yet. In many ways, we're ahead of the game. And there's a lot of people that need to come along on this journey too because they may feel quite uneasy about the fact that the private sector now wants to talk about management in the public interest. So I would argue that actually businesses are far more vulnerable from Nexus issues than you realize, or we realize. And in fact, if we think about their risks and our risks, there's a lot of alignment. And that led us a few years ago to come up with this concept of shared risk and opportunity. And I know Greg and I have gone back and forth on whether he agrees with shared risk, but let me posit this idea. I suggest that what I want as an NGO from River Basin, while it's completely different from what you want as a company, and I don't expect you to care about fish. You're not here to care about fish. I'm here to care about fish. You're here to make money, right? And the government's here to do its job, build institutions, deliver on the public good, make sure that people are delivered on their human rights. We each have a different need out of a common resource. And we need to start seeing that. We actually have to understand that 90 to 100% of what I need as an environmental NGO to protect the biodiversity that I care about is exactly what business needs to mitigate business risk. They need institutions, they need coherent government, they need regulations, they need people who are polluted to get penalized, they need people who do well to be rewarded. They need to make sure that people downstream are getting their water. They need government to step up and allocate and properly permit and manage water as if it mattered. That's what I need. We need the same damn thing. So let's start aligning agendas. And even those sectors like mining that you would think are out there on their own and don't care about this agenda, they absolutely understand, because like those cowboys in that picture just before, they know that when they fight their corner, they lose. And that's the real rub here, that as we are dealing with stressed systems, that the fighting your corner attitude of business is going away rapidly. And more the idea of collaboration as a way forward is going to be the partnership model of choice. Now, I know we're dealing with some sectors that are out on their own right now. They think that they have, you know, we could talk about the oil and gas sector, for example, that maybe is not having a discussion about trade-offs yet. Eventually they may, but I'm surprised myself by the number of sectors that are in this discussion with us. It's not just the food and beverage guys. It really is a wide spectrum of people who want to have this discussion. And I think it also is indicative of a number of these initiatives now that are really pushing the envelope on what is the role of the private sector in development, whether it's WRG or the Water Futures Partnership or the World Bank or UN Global Compact. There's a number of initiatives now that are saying, what is the role of the private sector in delivery of development going forward? And not a lot of people have stopped and said, hey, am I even comfortable with that idea? You know, I've certainly stopped myself once in a while and go, hold on a second, do I like that idea? And that led a number of us to work through the CEO mandate, and the UN Global Compact CEO Water Mandate is the water component of the compact. And we worked together with the companies who are endorsing the compact to set up this engagement in water policy guidelines. So what would engagement in water policy from a company look like? What would be your guiding principles? How do you avoid policy capture? How do you avoid data capture and access to interest and information? How do you become transparent and collaborative, et cetera, et cetera? I think it's worth reading this report. It came out 3 years ago now. It's a very important piece of work, and I think it's at the vanguard of kind of articulating that idea of we really do need to frame this discussion with the private sector differently. It can't be just one where we tax them and regulate them and keep them out of the conversation. They use water, they move water through supply chains, they pollute water, they are a huge asset to gaining the environmental and social issues that many of us in this room are trying to deal with, and I think we need to redress that paradigm. It's not all roses. There's some massive fights along the way, but I just don't think we can go ahead in the future just fighting each other. We've got to look for collaboration. And this is really my last slide. Kim will talk more about this. Our work with SAB and Miller has been going on for a number of years. We just put this report out a couple of weeks ago. My colleagues were supposed to be here to present it, but unfortunately couldn't make it. What I like about this report is it's really starting to give a company perspective of the nexus that isn't just about what's my efficiency, what's my impact. It's asking a set of questions that we would ask, or you would ask, and that is government building the institutions required to deal with the nexus? What is the level of development and nature of economic development in your country? And more importantly, how does resilience thinking inform nexus discussions and development planning in your country? Because these things are fundamental to business being able to operate, for us to be able to protect what we want to protect, and actually to deliver on growth and development SDGs that we're all here to try and inform. So as we go forward in this discussion today and think about informing the SDGs, I want to raise the voice of the private sector in this. They actually are a strong and credible voice in arguing for the kind of SDGs that all of us are asking for around water. And I take the point that Anya was making before, that water is the weak link here, and we need to make sure that water is not excluded. I think the private sector has a huge role to make sure it's not excluded, and I want to encourage them to raise that voice as we go forward. It's going to be extremely important. If you want to read more about our ideas on water stewardship, please download the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's great to see a really clear model for what the various roles are, and it forms the basis of good understanding of each other for multi-sectoral partnerships. So thank you very much, Stuart. I'd like to introduce Dan, who has been at PepsiCo for more than 20 years, and with the driver of water stewardship and a leadership role around the Nexus globally. So Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine and Jamie and Felix and everyone for hosting this event. Just a bit of a background about PepsiCo, and not a commercial, but something actually that will help explain why we're interested in the Nexus. About 50% of our revenue comes from beverages, and about 50% comes from foods. 13 of our top 20 top volume spend raw materials come from an agricultural plant. So for us, the Nexus issues, the Nexus risks, and certainly the Nexus opportunities come through sustainable agriculture. And to help set the stage and calibrate everyone so that we're all on the same proverbial page, I have a short video to share with you that comes from the University of Minnesota Global Landscapes Initiative. And it really talks about the challenges with which we are collectively faced with feeding 9 billion people within the planetary boundaries. So if you would, a quick video. So the front end of the video certainly can be depressing, I guess, saying that mildly, when you hear some of those factoids, certainly pertinent to the Nexus. And I learned a long time ago that you really should never go to your boss or, in fact, your wife or your husband to talk about problems without at least a couple of solutions, because that really helps move the dialogue along. And the good news is, I think in the video you did see reference to some solutions. So it's things like the big conversation, having an international dialogue, and fora like these are so critical in helping understand and move that dialogue along. Investing in real solutions, not just talking conceptually, not just talking about theory, but actually having impact on the ground. Everyone at the table, Lord knows there are many critics of the food and beverage industry, and I'm sure the food and beverage industry is critical of many critics, but you really do need to hear those voices. Our chair and CEO, Indra Nooyi, always says we owe everyone the respect of listening to what their point of view is. And admittedly, you may not always agree with it, but listening and respecting the points of view is the first step toward true collaboration. Collaboration, imagination, and determination. Those are the three best words that I take away from that video. And in fact, in the session just before this about entrepreneurship, I think in many ways, millennials and entrepreneurs kind of hold the solutions to many of the crises that the world faces, because they do bring such an innovative and imaginative lens to many of those problems. We were asked as panelists to also look at the declaration that I think all of you have seen by now. And I picked out just a few passages that were particularly resonant in the context, number one, of the video, but also in the context of what it is we're trying to do at the Nexus. So you'll see here a mention of availability of water for business, and Stuart mentioned resilience. Certainly, a company who is dependent on agriculture cannot reach any level of resilience, certainly agriculturally, without understanding the water risks and without putting solutions in place collaboratively to mitigate and address some of those risks. Forward-looking companies will assess risks, and I'm so glad I took out the World Economic Forum chart from my presentation, because it seems it has been certainly addressed, which is a good thing, because the world really is starting to understand risks and the interconnectedness of risks in a much more acute way. The key thing on this second part here, though, is long-term business plans. Stuart talked about the evolution of business and corporate engagement. Being on the inside, I would say one of the biggest things that I've seen, the biggest evolutions, thankfully, is from an almost obsessive focus on short-term results to a balance between short-term results and also long-term strategy. And certainly, the crises of the magnitude that we face at the Nexus or outside the Nexus are not ones that can be solved quarter to quarter. They're not even ones that can be solved in 3 or 5 years. It really does take 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years, and everyone needs to understand that. And then finally, responsible water stewardship, I would say responsible Nexus stewardship, really does require input from so many different players. Technical expertise of businesses, effective government policies. In some way, that's sort of nirvana. And certainly the role that academics play, bringing academic rigor to so many of those applied on-the-ground practices. With the first one, when we talk about water availability, I just wanted to stress and really highlight it's not all about availability. And I am, among other things, one of the water subject matter experts for the corporation. So I know just how complicated water alone can be. Nevertheless, bringing it into a Nexus conversation where things get really difficult and really complicated. But just to show some of the complexity on this slide, I think a company, certainly a multinational company, operating in today's ecosystem has to take a really comprehensive look at how they address issues and how they seize opportunities. So for example, water. We certainly are respecting water as a human right. We do that very publicly in terms of our commitments. We came out in 2009 with a policy to respect water as a human right, actually before the UN did. And honestly, in all candor, I thought this was going to be easy because so many of the things we're doing are already respecting water as a human right. Well, 5 years later, we are still what I would say at the very beginning of that journey. It's a worthwhile journey, it's an important journey, but it is a complicated journey. And again, it underscores the need to be in this for the long term. What you see in the center of the slide really speaks to the importance of setting goals, quantitative goals, and how motivating those goals can be. We set a goal years ago of providing access to 3 million people with safe water. Weren't sure that we could get there. We got there 3 years early. Great, one company can do that, but imagine what 10 companies can do. Imagine what 10 companies with collaboration of government and NGOs and academics can do. That is literally, pun intended, a drop in the bucket, but it is at least a case study that can be used and hopefully replicated. Engaging at the watershed level. 10 years ago, we didn't really know much about watersheds. We knew that we sat within them. We knew that so did other users. Now we really are on a journey to understand the interconnectivity within those watersheds and outside of those watersheds. And then finally, efficiency. Efficiency, absolutely, Stuart, I think is where many companies begin the water stewardship journey. It's the easiest thing in many ways to control within their direct operations. It's one of the easier things to measure. When you start to expand that into things like valuing natural capital and ecosystem services, the metrics become a lot more difficult, a lot more nascent, and a lot more evolving. That said, water efficiency goals are still very important because it gets you the street credibility, if you will, of proving that at least that component of water stewardship, and there are many, is something to which you are committed. So operating at the Nexus, as I mentioned, requires innovation and commitment, long-term commitment. 2 case studies, really briefly, of where I think innovation and commitment and multilateral partnerships come into play, something that we're doing in India and something that we're doing in the UK. In India, the partners are the Columbia University Earth Institute and the Punjab Agricultural University. And at its absolutely most fundamental level, you can see on the left side of the screen something called direct seeding of rice. That is a technique that's been around there for decades, if not centuries. What PepsiCo did was we brought the capability and the innovation to automate the process of direct seeding. And by doing that, we are now allowing farmers, with their collaboration and input, to grow a staple food crop using 30% less water than traditional flood irrigation, and resulting in 70% fewer greenhouse gas emissions because you don't get methanogenic activity at the base of the crop. To me, that's an example, one example of where the Nexus really does come into play. The second, on the right side of the screen, you see the tensiometers. So a tensiometer is just a probe that you can put into the soil, and it tells you essentially when the crop needs to be watered. Historically, tensiometers in India have gone for about $40 to $200, depending on the complexity. The Earth Institute at Columbia decided to embark on a journey of getting that cost down, that fabrication cost down, and they did that significantly to $7 per tensiometer. As of yesterday, 7,000 farmers are now directly engaged with tensiometer use, and I learned earlier today that's as many employees as WWF has globally. So to put things in context, that's a lot of farmers. 400+ million liters of water are saved per season because of the deployment of those tensiometers, and about 20% savings in pumping energy. There again, a Nexus example. What's really exciting is if we're able to move those tensiometers and lift and shift those impacts from rice to wheat and then potentially to cotton, then we're starting to see things move beyond the food and beverage industry. And that's when the needle really begins to move in the right direction. The other case study I wanted to share was something in the UK. So we go from an emerging market to a very well-developed market, a sophisticated market, if you will, in the United Kingdom. Walker's is our brand there, Walker's Crisps, and they embarked on a journey a few years back, 50 and 5. So it's decreasing their carbon footprint and their applied water impact by 50% in 5 years. So by 2015, that is the expectation of our business in the UK. They realized very quickly that they would not be able to come anywhere near those goals without engaging very directly and very swiftly their potato growers. We are among the world's largest users of potatoes because of our Frito-Lay brands and Walker's and Smith's in Australia. So potatoes are very important to us. This is a video that I'm about to show you, and this is something that I'll end on, but it explains a program called iCrop. iCrop is something that was developed in collaboration with the University of Cambridge in the UK. So again, bringing academic rigor and academic innovation to applied science that our business in the UK is leading with the growers at the center. And iCrop is a way for you to essentially know when to water the crop at specifically the right time, with specifically the right amount, and with water directed to the root zone of those crops. And I think the savings, both in greenhouse gas emissions and water, are laudable. Now, this is a test of my technologic capability, because there's a blip with the video, so I was told how to come around that. Great, thank you. So in closing, I'd say the Nexus is absolutely critical. I would challenge everyone involved in Nexus discussions not to have it just be a discussion, and not, as Stuart mentioned, not to have it be a new buzzword. But for me, to really leverage a Nexus, it's the traditional idea of synergy. It's 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 6 or 10, and that's the hard part. It's easy to talk about the components of the Nexus. It's easy to talk about food and water, or water and climate. But when you start to really want to have the synergistic impact of all 3 or 4 of those together, that's when all systems are tested. Innovation is tested, capability is tested, investment is tested, but it's something that is absolutely worthwhile if we're to succeed in feeding 9 billion people within the constraints of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I remember the first synergistic cumulative risk assessment that I worked on in about 2007, and we had the world's leading synergistic risk assessor from San Francisco come to work with us in Australia. And he had 7 operational engineers in the room, and he was explaining to them what synergistic risk was, and there was sort of confusion on their faces. And he said, okay, imagine you're going to the bar and you've got 1 vodka and 1 ecstasy tablet. Now have 2 vodkas and 2 ecstasy tablets. Now have 3 vodkas and 3 ecstasy tablets. And you can sort of see their faces all of a sudden go, oh, right. But I think it's such nicer equation to think 1 + 1 = 3. And look at the implications, because while synergistic effects have been seen from a cumulative point of view to create lots of negatives, to think about them in the way Dan's talking about it, it's really about identifying it in a way that actually becomes more and more positive. So the more effect you're having by reducing the amount of water a farmer's using, the more ability you have to secure water for other uses, right? So you get so much more flexibility, and you can see the rationale for that stewardship that Stuart was talking about in the first presentation. Thank you very much, Dan. I'd like to welcome Kim to the stage. I first heard Kim speak about water, and she used a great case study in South Africa. We worked out it was from in 2008, so quite a long time she's been specialising in this field, and I welcome you, Kim, to come and talk. Thank you.
I'll hold your applause, that's okay. You guys, it's after lunch, I know, so I promise, I think there's a lavalier here. If you don't mind, I'm just going to move away from the podium just for a sec, just to make sure you guys are all with me. So, and tell me if this is on. Maybe if I put it forward rather than on top of me. There we go. Great. So it's really a privilege to be here today. It's exciting to be part of a discussion or a debate on the post-UN development goals or Millennium Goals. And I really find it interesting, just this idea of debating the nexus between food and water and energy. And I think Dan did such a nice job of just laying out that it's really not a debate or a discussion. It's just how companies and NGOs and governments should be acting and are acting. And Stuart did such a nice job of talking about the work that our parent company, SAB Miller, has been doing with World Wildlife Fund. And I also want to give you a peek under the tent on what that means for a beer company here in the United States, MillerCoors. You might be familiar with Miller and you might be familiar with Coors, but to put it in perspective, in 2008, we came together as one joint venture. So we have 8 major breweries across the United States. And I'll only be talking, unfortunately, not about South Africa today, but just about the United States. And for us, again, water is a priority. Energy is a priority. Obviously, the agricultural supply chain and food is a priority. When we look at water in particular, it's the main ingredient in our product. It's the main process that you use in the brewing process, whether it's heating up, cooling down, pasteurization, runs through all our pipes, all of our kettles, all of our filtration. It also helps water our crops. So making sure that we work together collaboratively to really improve and protect the quality and quantity of water in our watersheds, as well as energy and food, is critical for us as a beer company. And picking up on some of the themes that you've heard throughout the day, it is a shared responsibility. For a while, for decades, I think, people looked at government to solve this problem. And it's time that the private industry, NGOs, and government lock arms and we solve it together. It's a shared risk and it's a shared responsibility. And we need to be together and looking at solutions. So for us, again, back to that CEO water mandate that Stuart talked about, we always focused on water efficiency. What are we doing inside our own 4 walls to be as efficient as possible? But then we started to expand with the CEO water mandate and looked at, well, what's happening in our watersheds and how are we responsible for taking leadership action in in that area? What's our water footprint? Stuart and I were talking, back in 2008 when we were really concerned about what that number was, as opposed to now that we know what the footprint is, let's put some action in place and make a difference. And then, of course, how do you get your community, your employees rallied around, such a large priority? So water efficiency. Real quick, this is what we've been doing. We want to make more beer, but use less water. And we started in 2008. We had laudable goals. We thought really great about this. And we set a 2015 goal to go to, at the time we were at 4.1. So it took us 4.1 barrels of water to produce 1 barrel of beer. And we said by 2015, so we were a new company, by 2015, let's get that number down to 3.5. And I'll tell you honestly, we had no idea how we were going to do it. We looked at our strategies, we thought we could make some difference, and in 2009, we were at 4.1. In 2010, we were at like 4.0999. And it took us a while to figure out because we were looking at water as a capital investment as opposed to a process and a people investment. So we went down to some breweries in South America that are part of SAB Miller, and we took a look at them and we said, well, they're as old as the breweries that we have in the United States. They have similar systems, but they're doing a great job on water efficiency. And what we learned, it's an investment in people. 80% investment in people, 20% investment in capital. And as soon as we came back, we got our people charged. We talked to the steam fitters. We listened to what they wanted to say about steam. We didn't always rinse the kettles twice. We took a look and said, maybe we only need to rinse that kettle once. Maybe we don't need to do it every time we switch brands. And we really looked at ways that we could reclaim water, not back in the product, but throughout the system, in our pasteurizers and everything. So in about a 2-year period, we saved over 1 billion gallons of water. That's the equivalent of what 11 million people would use in one day, or roughly the size of Belgium. So we're really proud of those efforts. We actually hit our 3.5 goal early. At the end of 2013, we were at 3.488. And we're still rocking and rolling, so we've got more work to do. But I really want to talk to you about our watershed risk assessments, because we got to make a difference. And if we're only talking to ourselves and we're only looking inside our 4 walls, we're going to hardly, no pun intended, or every pun intended, be a small drop in a big bucket. So for us, we've got 8 major breweries. What's happening in those watersheds? We have a brewery in California. We have a brewery in Fort Worth, Texas. And we have a brewery in Golden, Colorado. Those watersheds are water scarce or water stressed. If you look long-term availability for agriculture, population growth, and industry growth and demands, there's going to be issues in those watersheds. So we needed to act. So we've done watershed risk assessments, put in mitigation plans, and here's just an example of one of those programs. In Fort Worth, we're in the Trinity River watershed. The Trinity River supplies 40% of water to the state of Texas. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. And I wish I could remember this number, but I was at a North Texas Water Summit. The amount of people moving into this area on a daily basis is staggering. Being a girl from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I thought, wow, unbelievable. But one more day of that cold, I'm on my way back down to Texas, because I can understand why people are moving there. So we want to make sure, obviously, we want to be brewing beer in Texas for the long term. But we don't want to be competing with our partners in agriculture and industry and population growth. We want to work together to share this responsibility and share this risk. So this gentleman here in the shadow, his name is Gary Price. And he's a great cattle rancher that has a large cattle ranch, about an hour and 45 minutes outside of our brewery, but in the same watershed. And so we started really small with Sue and Gary Price. And we talked to them about, we had this program called Water as a Crop, with a nonprofit partner, Sand County Foundation. And then we looked at how can we really conserve water in this area. And the main thing is if it rains in Texas, it's really important. The ground's so hard, you want to keep the water on the ground as long as possible and reduce the runoff. So one of the main things we did with him is plant really tall native prairie grass. And what we've been able to see with this prairie grass, we can keep the water on the ground and reduce runoff by about 60%. What's even better is he is so credible. He talked to other ranchers, farmers, and growers, and he got more people involved in the project. And then Texas A&M joined, and Trinity Rivers joined, and cities joined, and then NRCS came to the table. And they were able to provide a $9 million grant for this watershed. And we now have about 102 conservation projects going in that area and still growing. So really exciting opportunities of working in the watershed. Water footprint. Care about our beer, more than 90%, we've been talking about this morning, of our footprint comes from our agricultural supply chain. This is not a blame game. This is us working together to see how we can solve that problem together. So we started first, we hadn't done our risk assessment yet, but we had some growers, again, starting with 1 group or 2 groups in Silver Creek in Idaho. These are the Stevensons. John and Elizabeth Stevenson were willing to take a risk. Most of the crops in this area are irrigated. So we came in and we talked to them about building a showcase barley farm. How do we put the suite of best water management practices on one farm so people could learn, come there, and we could really share it with the rest of our growers? The short story is that after putting in satellite, variable rate, reducing sprinklers, turning off end guns, cleaning out nozzles, and a lot of other conservation practices, in 2 years we saved 270 million gallons of water. That's what we would use in 1 brewery in 2 months. So again, where you can create impact as partnerships is in your ag supply chain as well as within your own 4 walls. So we moved from that, and this is what an end gun, just in case. In Idaho, with irrigated crops, you're sending these waters out to the corners of the acres, and the barley's barely getting it. It's evaporating before it gets there. You know, really hot days. The quality of the barley in the corners isn't at the standards that we would even buy anyways. So we shut those end guns off, which is a big risk. These obviously are the livelihood of our growers, but they were willing to try it on 2 farms, and then planted vegetation to keep water in. And what we saw is better yields, 50% reduction in energy, and again, as I talked about, the water savings. So this is where we're going now. We can't solve it we can't just be talking to ourselves or just talking to our growers. We have 850 growers in 4 states in the United States. So we're collaborating because our barley growers grow wheat for General Mills. And guess what? They grow potatoes for Pepsi, and they grow potatoes for McDonald's, and they grow, you know, a lot with other companies. So we're really focused on working together and bringing others within the watersheds together to make a difference. And one of our projects is with General Mills in Idaho. So then we looked at our entire egg supply chain. This is just an example of the 4 states. And we did long-term 2050 projections for water availability in the areas where we're sourcing barley. And we've got a real issue in San Luis Valley, Colorado. Is anybody in or around that, from that area? We have 150 growers in San Luis Valley. It's just the southeast part of Colorado, just outside of New Mexico. And 150 growers, they usually have 7 inches of rainfall a year, less than the city of Phoenix. But they've been very fortunate because they have large ranges and they rely on the snow melt. Well, they haven't had the snow melt in the last couple decades. So we want to make sure that we can help those growers stay in that region and the potato growers that are there. And we've been working on projects with them, working with NRCS again. They're just a fabulous partner to us, and trying to get funding and resources to make a difference in that area. So lots of meetings, stakeholder meetings. Dan talked about final irrigation. This, again, about some of the crops are irrigated, some aren't. So what we're trying to understand is when is peak irrigation? Because we estimate that the growers are going about a week to 2 weeks past peak in their irrigation. And if you think about those big, gigantic pivots that I kind of showed in that one picture, if you're irrigating, you're typically turning them on in March and off in October, and it's about 2 million gallons of water every time that pivot comes across. So really great opportunities if we can fine-tune this. And then lastly, publishing best management practice guides. So we were at a meeting last week with Bear Crop Science. They said, we'd love to see what you're learning. Let's share it. Let's learn together. Sharing it with our barley growers, sharing it with other growers so that we can keep building it and really learning from each other as we go. And that's our story. And just, you know, one thing just to kind of leave you with, no water, no beer. So this is really important, hopefully, for all of us to get in and make sure that we can make a difference. Thanks.
Kim. Very good way of summing up the challenges there. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Puvan, who has been establishing a sustainable agriculture platform with the United Nations Global Compact, and before that worked for a very important, famous palm oil plantation company in Malaysia. So welcome, Puvan. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you to Felix and the others for offering me this chance to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at the Compact with regard to sustainable agriculture, a program, in fact, which both PepsiCo and SAB Miller have been actively involved in. How should I get to my presentation? Do I just click?
Yes.
Oh, no. Okay, there we are. Right, so my name is Puvan. I'm with the UN Global Compact, as Katherine said. I joined the Compact in order to start this program. Prior to this, I was with a company called Sime Darby, which is the largest producer of sustainable palm oil in the world. It's also one of the largest producers of palm oil in the world, but it's a conglomerate, a Malaysian-based conglomerate. And so the issues of sustainability are fairly pervasive in that organization. And a lot of the work that I'm doing here comes from the fact that that company was a founding member of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which some of you may know, and that's probably the most mature of the commodity roundtables that were set up initially through WWF's efforts and others like Unilever and so forth. What we had recognized is that there's only so much that a round table can do, because you only have leading and responsible companies that want to do the right thing and NGOs working together in areas where the voluntary, self-enlightened ethos can gain some traction. But then you look around the table and you think, well, where are the governments? What are the governments actually going to do to try to help us to move these things along? And sometimes that becomes the impasse. That's the block that allows initiatives like the roundtables and so forth to go to scale. So I think what I'm going to talk about here, I suppose, maybe dovetails quite nicely into what the others have said, and in particular with things which Stuart had mentioned earlier on. The Food and Agriculture Business Principles, as they're now called, because they were called the Sustainable Agriculture Business Principles at the beginning, are actually designed to have a common language between the stakeholders. In particular, the type of language which we've heard here from the companies and policymakers. Now, we hear this language being spoken in different places all the time, but somehow it gets lost in translation. And so here we see the Food and Agriculture Business Principles as we have drafted them. And when I first presented this, I suppose, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, when the first draft was out, I had a number of colleagues in New York from the other agencies, UN agencies, as well. You know, what's the big deal about this? We've been talking about this for the last 20 years. The difference, I said, is that this is now coming from the companies. All this language here has been agreed to by the companies within the Global Compact, by the leading actors, the SAB Millers and the PepsiCos and the Unilevers and the Nestlés, who said these are now the non-negotiable aspects of how we want to do business with other stakeholders, including governments. So unless governments can now start to provide the environments that make these things, these outcomes, a reality, we're not really interested. So that's the big shift. The big shift is that, yes, other people have been talking about it for 20 years, but now companies are able to commit to these kinds of outcomes. To give you a quick idea of the process that we went through, we launched this initiative at Rio Plus 20. We had a very small meeting there, and then there was an expression of interest from all of those present that the way to perhaps codify the idea of sustainable agriculture in the context of the United Nations would be to look at sustainable agriculture as being a conduit, a channel, a solution for the poverty alleviation aspects, the economic development aspects, and of course the security aspects, and in this case we call them food and nutrition security. And the idea of these principles is to essentially have this bridge, these bridges built between business and enablers. And enablers we would call the check and balance community, the NGOs and others, and the consumers of course as well, and the regulatory bodies, the governments and the governance and the standards and so forth. So essentially this was to allow that idea of sustainable intensification, which is expressed so vividly in the Rio Plus 20 document. How do you make that happen? If we're going to have partnerships, the first thing that you need is to have the common language. And so this is how we went about beginning to build that common language. We had 3 meetings very close together at the beginning of last year to try to set down the basic framework, and that's when we had 30 or 40 of the leading participants in the Global Compact who are food and ag companies come together, and we went through the process of what are the issues, what does success look like. At that point it was called SABPs, the Sustainable Agriculture Business Principles. Success would mean that people would be able to take them up, would be able to understand them, governments and companies would be able to sit together and agree that yes, these are the outcomes that we wanted, so forth. Then we had an idea of whittling all of this down, and then we produced a white paper. The white paper went out for consultation. After the first round, it came back with a certain draft, which had a sort of certain language to it. It's now going out for its second round, which will conclude in March, and we expect that the final principles will be ready by May. I'll come to what that means towards the end of this presentation. So what the FABs are is it's a frame of outcomes, factors, and actions. And what we're asking is, what are the outcomes that sustainable agriculture should achieve? What are the factors that are key and material to each outcome? And what actions are needed to deliver these outcomes? So there were 16 factors that were identified through these conversations. And the reason why they're presented in this format, in this matrix format, is because you need all the factors. They all have to work together. There is no single factor that is going to solve the problem of sustainable agriculture, and by the same token, you cannot purport to be in the space of sustainable agriculture unless you're prepared somehow to be able to address the 16 factors. Not necessarily all by yourself, but you need to be able to recognize that in order for something that I am doing as, let's say, a company to work, I need to ensure that the others that are around me are also doing the bits that they can do. So we then break down the factors into what each one of these factors may constitute. There's a lot of language here which you will see exists in many, many texts. And that was one of the points, to sort of bring together the language on a kind of common understanding of these factors to make sure that people were satisfied that when we talk about something like maintaining and enhancing biodiversity, you've captured all the big points, the things that are really non-negotiable. So we then created the opt-in clause. The opt-in clause is where if you are an actor and you say, look, I find certain things important to me, certain factors are more important to me than other factors, or certain factors are where I can make a difference, whereas other factors I have no control over. So this matrix shows how the 6 outcomes relate to the 16 factors, and what you should be able to do as an actor is to position yourself on this matrix to say, well, okay, if I'm really concerned with creating economic viability and shared value because I'm a financial institution, what are the things that I should be looking at, and where are the pressure points that I would be able to exert an influence? So this kind of matrix, and there is a deeper version of this, but essentially it says we don't expect everybody to do everything, but what we expect is for people to understand what they can do and how this fits into the bigger picture of what they expect other people to do. And the bigger picture then manifests itself in this sort of diagram. So we talk a lot about company action, and in fact even in many UN documents, and there's the kind of the fear of all overseas development assistance now being essentially outsourced to private companies, and then private companies are just shocking profiteers, and they're going to be exploiting all the resources, and that kind of debate. Okay, there may well be some validity to all of that, but essentially that's a huge red herring. The issue is, how do you get to where you need to get to using the kind of smart mix of actors and what they can bring to the table in terms of money, capacity, R&D, and so forth. And this is what we feel is probably appropriate. In the first instance, we have to recognize that company action can only take you so far. And company action, from the basis of saying, okay, we're willing to make sure the right codes are in place, we're willing to make sure our food is safe, we're willing to make sure that we use the right drip irrigation, we can do all of that stuff. But there's other stuff that we need to do, and that other stuff requires that we have to work in partnership. So the guidelines for partnership must also be very clear. And there's no end of partnership opportunities out there. I mean, Stuart had also talked about the CEO Water Mandate, which is a global compact initiative. That lays out some very, very clear ways of how you can partner with others if water is the thing that you're looking at. So that partnership bracket envelops the company action. Now, beyond that, we've also got what we call enabling action. Now, that's a polite word for what governments need to do in order to make any of this work. If you do not have law, regulation, enforcement, if you do not have that kind of support for the basic R&D that needs to be done in public universities that's going to then permeate through the entire community, if you do not have infrastructure that's going to enable you to transport your bits and pieces from where they're grown to where they need to be shipped and so forth, if you do not have the regulatory environment in place to make sure that people are not being, their land is not being stolen and they're not being essentially exploited for the resources that they have under their feet, this is not going to make any company action or any CSR effort meaningful. It's going to be, to use the other puns, a drop in the ocean. It's going to be meaningless. So that enabling action envelope is arguably the most important. And all of these three then have to work together if you want to get the outcomes that you get. So we had the principles. They came out in December in draft form. As I said, they're now going through their second period of consultation. What happened since December was interesting. We had people looking at the draft principles saying, well, okay, now that we've got a basis to have a conversation, we can do other things. One would be that we can now start to identify what are the gaps in the value chain, and the gaps meaning where do we not have bits which can currently be codified in a responsible fashion. For example, the invisible bits, like finance, like logistics. There are parts of the ag value chain that actually you just sort of don't know about because nobody really talks about them. It's not because it's agriculture, it happens all over. Where really, do we know, the ships that are carrying stuff from here to here, and really what do they do when they're on the high seas? And so, there's all sorts of stuff happening out there which we just don't know. I mean, we know a bit about it because some of us have now watched sort of Captain Phillips, but except, other than that, there's still a lot of stuff which we don't know about. So what's happened is that people have come up and said, well, okay, you're addressing producers, you're addressing retailers, you're addressing processors in the middle, but there are these bits that join others up that don't have codes, or nobody's watching them, or nobody knows what they do. So that is a chunk that came up. The next thing would be the idea of reporting on materiality. Some of you, those of you who are involved in corporate reporting will know GRI, will know the G4 standard, for example. And one of the interesting things about of GRI is that they move towards the idea of determining for yourself what is material to you. So when you now start reporting as a company, you can say, well, actually, these bits are not material to me. And there is a discussion here as to, well, obviously people are going to be pushing forward the bits which, put them in a good light, and perhaps are less emphatic about the things which, do not. So what we have said here with the Food and Agriculture Business Principles and the companies that we've worked with is that these things are non-negotiable from a materiality standpoint, which means this becomes the materiality list that if you're in food and ag, you should be applying to your reporting across the board. And we don't leave that discussion of materiality up to you anymore. And the last point is that it establishes a common basis upon which partnerships can be formed between governments, companies, and other stakeholders. This was an intent from the very beginning, but I have to say that we were genuinely happily surprised when, after the first draft was issued in December, we had uptake in this arena, and a block of governments approached us and said, fantastic, let's now start working together with our companies to develop a way of talking to each other. So this just gives you a little bit of detail into the gaps. One of the gaps, for example, is Global Principles for Sustainable Soil Management. Since December, we've been able to have some meetings specifically with companies who are dealing with soil, and how it is that that's fitting into the big picture about fertilizer, nitrogen, and phosphates, those slides that you saw earlier. We have then linked together the relevant agencies in terms of, at the UN, you've got the Convention for the Combating of Desertification, and all of those things, Soil Leadership Academy, and we have another meeting this week or next week, which will be to bring the companies into that arena and to start discussing how it is that they would be able to talk about outcomes. So importantly, we're not talking about soil. We're talking about how to bring everything which has been discussed in soil to the table where it can then activate action. Here is a little bit of detail on the reporting piece. Now what you'll see here is that on level 1, we have the Global Compact Communications and Progress, which is something that all Global Compact signatories have to submit every year to remain part of the program. And then you've got GRI, which is a non-qualitative assessment, usually, of, are you reporting well? So that tier 1 we see as being the top level, and at the bottom you've got certification, which is all of the certification standards and so forth that we all know and love. And in the middle you've got these bits which are the aggregators. So for example, tomorrow we have a meeting with exactly those people, WWF, CDP, FFP, Oxfam, GRI, to talk about how to build that table such that if you make a claim at the top in Tier 1 and you evidence it with a certificate in Tier 3, you're seen to be doing the right thing. This is that other project in terms of ASEAN. We have a 10-block country in ASEAN that is now taking up the Food and Agriculture Business Principles and matching it with their ASEAN Integrated Food Security Framework, which is a 20-year plan for the region. So this is my last slide. The last slide is we have a Nexus. And the Nexus is fantastic, that we have been able to put all these things together in a circle: energy, water, climate change, and so forth. But for us, at the Compact, the Nexus actually is what does this mean in the pragmatic sense of resource scarcity, political and economic stability, and food security. And this has also emerged in a number of the slides that you've seen already. So for us, the Nexus is how these two things meet and where the trade-offs have to be made in order that you can move from what is an ideal situation, the principles, to a pragmatic situation, which is resource scarcity and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to end with a challenge there to the panel. Perhaps that could be the first question. As if anyone else has questions, you could come up to the microphones. That would be good. So if we just go back to that last slide there, the one about the different points, the resource scarcity. See if I can remember it off by heart. Resource scarcity, political security, and food security. How does the panel respond to that? Do you see that as a relevant nexus that might be an evolution from the energy, water and climate change one? Stuart, perhaps we could start with you.
Can you repeat the questions?
Well, we've got, Puvan's basically said, rather than thinking energy, water, climate, what about we think resource scarcity, political, economic stability and food security as the relevant way of, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we was a presentation yesterday. I think Carla from UNEP put up a slide that showed how the different institutions frame the nexus, and it's interesting to see how many different variations there are on it. And I actually lean more towards this one myself because I think this is where the policy discussions are more in food security, energy security, and political economy objectives are more relevant to the people we're trying to influence than talking in sort of broader terms that are still confusing to people. So, I mean, I'm fine with the articulation of that to a general audience, but when I'm thinking policy and the people I'm trying to influence, it's really those energy debates or food security debates or water planning debates are the ones I'm trying to get that message into. So that works for me, actually.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart. Dan?
Yeah, I think in a way they're sort of means to an end. They're completely supportive and complementary. So if you're able to crack the code on energy management and water stewardship and climate or carbon management, then ultimately the outcomes are that you are responsibly using resources, right? So you are mitigating resource scarcity. You're helping to foster political and economic stability. And you're finally dealing with the scourge of food insecurity. So I think the two are I mean, they're not at odds at all, in fact.
Kim?
Those are obviously brilliant answers. The only thing I can add to it is just making it a little practical. So for us, I mentioned we have a brewery in California. And so what we're trying to do right now is really address this issue with all the stakeholders that are concerned about, that nexus, as well as the nexus on the left, because I think they're really similar, and come together and figure out how we can work together to address those issues.
Yeah. Okay. So we might turn to the first question that we have from the audience.
Sure. I had a question about synergies within the private sector, and I know this is probably maybe more information you want to get into, but go as far as you want. We're for example, we're managing sustainable sourcing agreements with Unilever and Kellogg's and Mondelez right now, and not a single one of them is addressing water the same way. I understand that everybody has to be able to take credit for something on their questionnaires that they fill out for Walmart, but do you see this being a challenge in that we're not finding synergies within, we've 2 or 3 or 4 different programs in the same watershed? And if it is a challenge, what might be done to create more synergies in how different brands are addressing water and ag?
So Is it a challenge? Absolutely, yes, and it has been for some time. In some ways, the Walmart questionnaires have highlighted that challenge because we are all using different languages, and some of us have more visibility to on-farm activities than others. I would say I'm an eternal optimist, so the glass really is always half full, but I think in this case there's reason to be optimistic. Over the last 3 years or so, PepsiCo, with a bunch of partners, has developed something called the Sustainable Farming Initiative. And it is specifically to try to deal with that redundancy, that ambiguity, the lack of a common lexicon at the farm level. So we launched it last year with our potato growers in North America. It's now been launched with each of our core crops. And it looks at indicators at the farm level, and I stress at the farm level because it's not crop specific. It looks at what's going on at the farm. So when Kim says General Mills grows one crop on the same farm that MillerCoors grows, that PepsiCo grows, by improving the activities on the farm, everyone benefits. The other thing is it uses economic, social, and environmental indicators. We mapped our Sustainable Farming Initiative indicators against no fewer than 30 different codes, including Rainforest Alliance and LEAF and Global Gap and a bunch of others. And we are actively right now looking for ways that there would be reciprocal recognition among those codes. When SFI is launched publicly in a big way, it will not be a PepsiCo code. It will be a collaborative code. It will be with Unilever. It will be with our suppliers. It will be with academics. So that's kind of, that's within the next 2 to 3 years, we're hoping that that momentum will really start to pick up and it'll start to converge toward common metrics, common on-farm practices, and even better, ways to help growers improve. So included with this is a compendium of good and best practices. So if somebody's doing something really noteworthy to manage water on farm, that should be shared.
And just to kind of put it in perspective again, sorry to be the practical person. I guess I'm much more yellow and red than blue and green. Yeah. So our headquarters in Chicago. So last week we held a summit with McDonald's and Pepsi and MillerCoors. Now, MillerCoors, our parent company, SAB Miller, happens to be one of the largest Coca-Cola bottlers outside of the United States. Obviously, Pepsi's not Coca-Cola, and McDonald's carries Coca-Cola. So here's essentially 3 groups getting together that have competing interests. But we sat down and said, let's map our commodities. And the folks from Pepsi talked about this tool, and we said, we want, we're all part of the consortium, we're all part of the index, we're all part of those KPIs. But if you have a tool that's working, will you share it with us, and how can we grow that together? Because it doesn't make sense to go to the same grower time and time again with different tools. So we're all trying our best, and I think we definitely all have to continue to go in that direction.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Question from you. Could you introduce yourself to start with?
Frans Verhagen of the International Institute of Monetary Transformation. A minute ago it was said that there are many ways of looking at Nexus. And I think, in my opinion, there are about 3 different levels of Nexus. First order Nexus, I would call it, is the one that we see on the left-hand side of the slide here. So the issues, energy, water, climate change, and how they are all linked together. The second one, the second order, I would call the political order: resource scarcity, food security, political economy, political stability. And then the third order of linkages are the 2 linkages, particularly the last one, to the international systems. And so one of the things that I've been working on is that particular linkage. And so what I've been proposing is to have, to take the international monetary system as the kind of basic system upon which all the others, like glue, are based upon. And so if we were to transform that particular system, then all the other linkages would also change. And so by taking a carbon standard to an international monetary system, we would be making all these order of linkages and really make substantial change in the whole kind of world order.
Did you want someone to comment on that, or was it just a statement?
No, I would be most interested in having comments, and
Okay.
people who are really interested in this. I have a workshop tomorrow afternoon on this topic, so. But I would be very much interested, particularly of our Global Compact person, and also of the WWF.
Okay, thank you. Puvan, do you want to?
Sure, I don't disagree. In fact, I think that the levels and the orders upon which we need to sort of look at the nexus issues is absolutely critical. So here, these are not two different conditions. For us, what I was trying to say is that for us, the nexus is the nexus between these two circles, and how it is that in order to deliver the higher order, we need to have a recognition of what is required for the first order. But, and I think this is what Stuart said, solving the first order does not necessarily solve the second order. And neither, in fact, does, in terms of expedience, unless we overlay perhaps a component of time. If we talk about deforestation and this, that, and the other, I mean, we have to understand that there are only certain goods and services and assets that people have to trade with each other. And at the moment, that may require a conditionality on a certain performance, let's say with regard to a forest, or let's say with regard to a certain political system, or let's say whatever. So this is the kind of discussion I think that we have to be able to have before deciding collectively how we move forward from one order to the next. To have a position where somebody says, look, it's impossible, we cannot move if this tree comes down. That's not necessarily the best way to articulate a step forward. I mean, we could say that, but unfortunately, we know that that's when things just stop. And when the conversation stops, we're not getting to any kind of, solution.
Thank you. Stuart?
Yeah. I agree. What you said sounds reasonable. I'd be curious to listen tomorrow to your session and hear what you have to say. I think in the work we did with SAB, we looked at the nexus from maybe a perspective that you would be interested in. And we looked at the resource endowments of certain countries and asked the question, how can you look at development of nations over time from a perspective of nexus on what they have, what they can trade for, which brings in that international element you described. And so I think in many ways, as we delve deeper into this, I think your orders are important. I also think scale is important as well. I would add a local, regional, and national, even international to some of these, because you have spheres of influence on the climate that you don't have for water at a global level and vice versa on the local. So I think there's a scale issue as much as an order one. But I'd like to learn more about your work and then give you a better comment back.
Thank you very much. To sum up, what we've heard is that the corporate sector is working on all sorts of different fronts to try and reduce the risks to themselves, but also in a multilateral way with other stakeholders and organisations like WWF to form up a solid way forward. And I imagine Puvan would invite you to participate in looking at the sustainable agricultural principles as well, and seeing if you'd like to make some comments on those before they finalise. So in all, what I'd like to sort of conclude on that might give you a little bit of an insight around how do we make this such that it's not just a conversation at a policy level, but also a conversation with the community, that the more awareness that there is in the communities, the more clarity there is around what the dilemmas are, what the trade-offs are, what the issues are, the more legitimacy and authority you have for the decisions that you make. One of the more frustrating projects I ever was involved with was where we were asked to do some consultation for a forestry project. They'd done an audit analysis of how much resource endowment there was. The one with the most endowment had the most amount of political debates and concerns from the community and from activist groups. And even though it had more resource endowment than other places even though it was actually being logged at a sustainable level, unlike other parts of the state. It was the area that was the most politically fraught, the one where the community hadn't actually made an agreement with the government or with the industry that it was satisfactory. That was the area that got shut down and locked up. So to the point that was made in one of the earlier sessions, we're in a context of very political environments. People want to participate in a transparent and open interaction around what the right decisions are. So the more able we are to have these conversations, not just with the policy elites like we have in the room, but with the public at large, I think the better off all of us will be, because the decisions that are being made will be seen as legitimate ones for everyone. So thank you all on the panel for the work that you've been doing, and congratulations for it. Thank you.